Hello there. My name is Dr. Gisela Kreglinger, and I have taught in university settings and in churches, and more recently also in wine shops because I've been researching and writing and teaching on a biblical and theological understanding of the gift of wine. I have found that knowing the biblical languages is really, really important for understanding this theme. When I went to graduate school to Regent College in Vancouver, I wanted to study with Gordon Fee. Learning the biblical languages was really, really important for really understanding the historical and cultural and linguistic world and getting a deeper understanding of what was happening in Scripture. I am very, very grateful that I have studied the biblical languages. And though I don't teach it in a university setting and I don't use it on a regular basis, when I need to research passages from Scripture or understanding certain contexts, to have those skills of understanding or being able to research the language is just so important.
Dr. Gisela Kreglinger, welcome to Exegetically Speaking.
It is a delight to be here. Thank you so much for having me, David.
You and Randy Frazee have written this book together called Wine and the Word. Why God Gave Us the Gift of Wine. And you've been researching this for a number of years, and you've gone back to the biblical languages and the Hebrew and the Greek and done all kind of interesting work with that.
Yes, I think one thing that was so surprising to me when I wrote my first book, The Spirituality of Wine, which is sort of a more academic book, where I did go into the biblical languages and actually have an appendix that lists all the Hebrew and the Greek terms related to wine, vineyards, agriculture. And it was just fascinating to learn how deeply the story of wine is into the story of God's redemption of his people. That it's not just sort of this sort of theme out there, but actually it's profoundly woven into how God redeems his people, how he calls them, how he provides for them. Just like the promised land, he provides a place for his people to be. And it was really important that there were vineyards in the promised land, that they could make really good wine to help celebrate that they're God's children and that God was their creator and their provider and their redeemer.
As I recall, and you probably remember this, is the very first thing Noah does when he gets off the ark is plant a vineyard, right?
God makes a covenant with Noah. Yes, he plants a vineyard. And I think that's a really, really important and very profound act of faith. Very, very hard work to plant a vineyard, to have to wait for 4 or 5 years for it to significantly bear fruit and then make a wine. But to go back to the act of planting a vineyard, I think it was really another act of faith in God's future. That God had saved him and that he was going to make Noah into a people and into a civilization. And what do you need to be a proper civilization? You need some sophisticated drink to help you celebrate and to help you be imaginative, create a civilization.
Paul tells Timothy to have a little bit of wine because apparently it's good for the stomach. And part of that has to do with the fact that water in those days was not the kind of purified, chlorinated, fluorified, whatever they put in the water to make it germ-free, and that people all over the world have struggle with having access to clean water.
Yeah. Well, you have to remember that up until the 19th century, wine was the primary medicine, not only in the ancient Near East, but also throughout Europe. And even in the US, it was only with the prohibition, the advent of distilled spirits, and the reaction towards that they stopped using wine as a medicine. That was a very common medicine that was used widely. So what Paul advises would have just been, a very common thing.
So he wasn't into some deep spiritual issue at that point. He was just trying to say, hey, if you want to feel better, this is, take a little Tylenol, take a little ibuprofen or something like that.
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
Kind of thing. I just read recently, or reread, this wonderful Song of the Vineyard which is in Isaiah chapter 5. It's really a parable where God puts together the choicest vines and the best land, and he tills it, and he builds walls around it to protect it, puts a tower there, he puts a wine press in it, he does everything he needs to do, and he waits for good grapes, but in fact he gets sour grapes, bad grapes. And so it's a parable about the people of Judah. It's a parable about God's judgment coming, because he ends up removing the wall. He doesn't allow it to rain on it anymore, and those kinds of things. So there's images both of gladness as well as images of judgment, it seemed like, through vintage, not having access to the wine.
Yeah, we have to sort of look at the literal understanding of wine as a gift from God and a blessing, and then the metaphorical use of vines, the vineyard, God's judgment and God's redemption. For example, this idea that Israel is a vine that God transplants and plants anew. That is a primary image of Israel. It's a vine, and then that gets extended to being a vineyard. And here now we come to the metaphorical use of the vineyard and the vine. That's a whole nother theme where God uses something very beautiful. A vineyard is to have fruit so that the nations can be blessed by God's. But what actually happened is, in the leadership of Judah, rather than taking what they have to bless nations, they were adding vineyard to vineyard and property to property, where they became big landholders with a lot of money and power, and they neglected the poor and the needy and the orphans and the widows. And Isaiah points that out over and over. And this is why God brings judgment, because the purpose of the vineyard was to bear fruit and bless the people, especially the vulnerable. And once the leadership got greedy and used it to sort of accumulate wealth and to oppress the poor, that's when God said, I am withdrawing my protection from you, and I'm going to let you go into exile.
So many wonderful themes in and around that we see lived out, sometimes tragically in the Bible, both the neglect of the poor as well as God's judgment in sending them into exile. It's a really interesting metaphor, interesting fact that God has given. Going back to Psalm 104, God has given us wine to gladden the heart, which is something you quote in your book early on. So if anybody wants to know more about wine and wine as a blessing in the biblical, historical, theological, then Gisela Kreglinger is the person that they need to know.
Yes, if I may say that. The Hebrew word for wine, yayin, is mentioned 141 times. In the vineyard, karem, about 97 times. Then feasting, mishte, about 44 times. So think about this tangible, physical, sensual gift of wine that helped to bring joy and celebration to life, is then used as a metaphor for God's people. This is what we are to bring to the world. So I really recommend that, as I said, I have an appendix in the spirituality of wine. If you're interested in the original languages, look at how much it is used and how affirmed it is over and over as a beautiful gift from God. That is to bring us joy, that is to bring us together, and that is to help us celebrate who God is and what he has done. Think about the Passover meal, think about the Lord's Supper, or think about the wedding feast that is to come, that already has begun in Jesus' life and ministry. We are to celebrate that God has not abandoned this world, but he's with us, and he wants to redeem us and make us into a blessing for all the nations.
What a wonderful message. Gisela, thanks for being with us today on Exegetically Speaking.
It is so great to be with you, and I hope for many more conversations.
Thanks again to Dr. Gisela Kreglinger. Her book, Wine in the Word. Whether you're writing commentaries or popular theology, you need to know the biblical languages. It's going to give you a head start as you engage in your work. And you know what's coming next, right? There's no place better than Wheaton College to fulfill that dream. Look in the show notes for details on how you can get started. Whether your interest is in graduate or undergraduate work, today is the day. Let's not waste it. Thanks to my wife, Kathy Capes, for editing this podcast. Thanks to our Wheaton-based team for their technical work and expertise. Thanks to Phil Kagi and David Capes for our music. Until next time, I am David Capes. Thanks for listening.